here we go. All right. So the thing I wanted to talk about first is that the whole endeavor, I have decided I want to call it historically inarticulate. Because I think that I think it has both a modern context and sort of a all-encompassing aspect for the idea that people don't know how to talk about the past. People are inarticulate about history themselves, and weirdly, I would say over the last 5 years especially, and it's getting worse now, I would say since COVID it's gotten even worse, is that people have become inarticulate to a historic level in the ability to speak to one another. And that not inarticulate and that I can't get my words out. It's that if you are somebody who disagrees with me about something, about anything, it doesn't have to be anything serious even, it just doesn't feel like you can get through to people anymore in a weird way. To me, I have this weird sense that we have shut down. We've totally shut down on a broad scale, that we just don't want to listen to somebody who disagrees with us. Because there's a righteousness to this to public discourse now. You're either on the right side of an issue or you're on the wrong side of an issue. That generally seems to be how it gets framed, how something in the news gets framed. And I don't think that's I don't want to say that that's new, because one of the running jokes about history that is that historians will always say that there's nothing new under the sun, that nothing new ever happens. But at the same time, this does feel, I don't know, new in some sense. That's not the right word, but it does feel like this is a recent occurrence, that we just don't seem to want to hear anybody who disagrees with us anymore about anything. So that's what I wanted to start with, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that, about first whether or not you feel that your average person, your average Joe or off the street actually knows how to talk about the past or understands anything about the past. And then two, whether or not you also feel like I do, or if you feel differently, that people are having a hard time getting through to one another that they disagree with.
Yeah, I mean, so I think for the first part, I think it can be difficult to talk about the past. One, because it's just knowing and understanding the past is a large endeavor in of itself. And I think the more I've studied history, the more I've talked with professors and scholars within the field, the more I've realized that anything that's outside of their specialty, they really don't kind of know. They know generic stuff if they have to teach it. But if you have PhDs and scholars who are unfamiliar with most of history except for kind of their specialty,
right,
then to have kind of the average Joe to have this kind of grand knowledge of history in of itself is, I think, one, it's unreasonable to expect that from somebody. But I think we want to expect that of ourselves if we've read a history book or we've taken history in school. I think there's this kind of obligation to be like, oh, I know the general history of most things, which isn't true even for specialists.
Right, it's true. Yeah.
So I think that makes it difficult. I think another reason is just with the ease of having something that can tell you almost anything you want. There's this kind of natural omniscience that comes with having a smartphone, and you can look up anything you want. You have the world kind of at your fingertips, which is good, and it's also bad. You can look up anything, but to verify whether it's true or not, I think makes it even more difficult to just kind of be able to understand what is historically accurate and what's historically inaccurate. So I think that can make it tough as well if you just want to Wikipedia something and you're going to about stuff from that page, which might be good, might be bad. But I think having kind of this disjointed relationship with history because of our difficult relationship with technology, I think makes it somewhat quite difficult to just grasp the importance and be able to discuss history and the past with meaning and humility.
Yeah, and that is actually something I wanted to say too. Is your point about your ease of access to technology is something I think you're on the money with that. Because one thing I think about a lot with the ease of access to information, well, what is essentially high quality information, is that you can, at the press of a button on Google, get any book in human history, essentially. I mean, they're not all there, but almost all of them is there. I mean, if you want the Communist Manifesto from 187 years ago, you can have that. If you want Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan from 1562, you can have that. I mean, you can find it. Mm-hmm. What I think that's done, weirdly, is that's coincided with a general lack of understanding of why knowing where you come from is important. I don't remember having a good quality history education as a kid. Even in schools, we had a fairly propagandistic understanding of American history, and it was repetitive. And I don't really feel like I knew anything about the past until I got to college. And then I feel like everything I knew about the past went out the window again when I went to grad school. Because you went deeper and deeper into the study of history, and every time you go deeper and deeper, you realize I don't know anything. If I don't know anything, no one else knows a dang thing. And but the thing is that's a zero-sum game. We can double down and say that I don't know anything outside of my area of expertise, but that's just an excuse, I think, for not for us, because we're not people. I'm not a sitting college professor, and you aren't either. Maybe one of us or both of us will at some point, but we're not there yet. But I think that has been an excuse for the people who were tasked with safeguarding and understanding of the past for future generations. I feel like they've used this, I don't know enough, I only know my expertise, as an excuse to not, like, I don't know, I'm stumbling over my words. I feel like that has been an excuse not to take responsibility over having an accurate understanding of the past for the general public. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it's just the feeling I get that there's a lack of responsibility that, well, I don't care if your expertise is in German literature. If you're an American history professor at a university, you need to be shepherding kids through an accurate understanding of what happened, not hiding behind the fact that, I specialized in this thing and I'm only doing this for a job. I get that maybe you didn't come to X university to teach American history classes, but that is your job. That is what you're tasked with doing. So those two things in tandem is that both this stepping back of the people who are supposed to teach newer generations and the rise of technology making it easier to look up anything you want at any time they made this weird thing where most people don't know where to look to begin with. And then when they do look somewhere, they don't know if what they found is accurate. And then they don't know how to talk about that because they've never had a quality education around any of these subjects.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue with, like you were saying, scholars kind of having using an excuse of like, oh, this is just my specialty, and therefore I don't have the responsibility outside of that. Mm-hmm. I think that's true, and I think part of the problem can be is because they're the experts, but I think within the ivory tower, there's mm-hmm. a disconnect between the ivory tower and the general public, and that is scholars' fault. It's coming down out of that ivory tower to communicate your specialty with the general public, and that's not necessarily maybe your vocational job, but more of your civic duty. And I think that relationship has unfortunately been misconstrued or not held accountable. And I think that's done a disservice to the community a lot, which is super unfortunate. I think there's some scholars who do, and there's probably a lot of professors who do more than we obviously probably see. Mm-hmm. like I know Professor O'Donnell at ASU. I believe she helps and talks a lot with high school history teachers, which is great. I think that's like exactly what community needs. But I think there's the understanding that your specialty goes beyond just your vocational sphere, but it actually enters into your civic duty as just an American citizen.
I actually think civic duty that's probably the issue, is I don't know if there is an understanding in the ivory tower of having a civic duty. That is not something I've ever heard expressed by any sitting academic I've ever come across. But I could tell you the ones that I think come closest to that would be the professors I had at Bloomsburg, because it's a relatively small state school. It's not a state school on the level of Arizona State. It's a state school that's run by the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, but it only has like 8,000 students. And the history professors there they all have a specialty, but they all teach generalized history courses. And they're not perfect either. I have my issues with the way that they did things. And there were big gaps in the education that even I received from them. But if you're going to have any sense of civic duty as an educator at a collegiate level, I think they're probably the closest I've ever seen come to it, because I've never seen any of them go, well, I only teach one class a semester. No, they all taught 5-6 courses a semester. And they were all big. They were all seminar levels. They were all Introduction to Global History, Introduction to Middle Eastern History, American History 1, American History 2, Asian history. They were big, sweeping, topics courses, which the problem there is that most kids only get one. Is that your average college kid comes to school and gets an Asian history 1 and a American history 1, and then they're done. They never take any more history classes, and so there's part of your problem. But I would argue that that's probably closer to doing some kind of civic duty, especially teaching American history in a way that isn't entirely negative. Is the closest thing I've ever seen an academic come to having some kind of civic duty in a history setting. Because I can't, like, the idea, I think about how specialized some of this stuff is at that I learned even at ASU. And I think, what purpose does that have? Even for me, I question the value of some of what I was made to take classes on. And I don't know, I'm not calling into question whether or not these people should have jobs, because they should, but if you're going to have some kind of value at all, and you're going to have some kind of purpose outside of the thing that you were hired to do research, I can't help but think that a lot of academics in the country probably get away with not being very useful in any sort of sense outside of their highly specialized field. Like, several of the professors I had, like Dr. Saki is one of them. She doesn't teach any seminar classes that I can think of. She doesn't actually teach undergrad students how to think about the past. She doesn't teach methods courses. She doesn't actually teach research outside of the graduate level. And I just wonder that, like, I don't know what good you're doing there, especially when there's such a weird, I don't know if you've ever seen the numbers on this, but there's such a hard left skew politically in academia too, that if you're not going to have any sense of civic duty, where you're not going to teach the general population of college students how to think about their own history and how they relate to it and how they should think about it in a productive manner, and you also have a hard left academic bent where it's something like 17-1 liberals to conservatives now on the average college. That's the ratio. That's creating a weird problem that I don't want to say. I don't want to be an alarmist, because I don't like thinking like this, but I do wonder if the people who teach you don't have any sense of civic duty, and they have no sense that what they're doing is for the good of the country they're a part of. It's instead that they're doing it because it's their job. And you already have a relatively far left, I don't want to say far left, you have a left-leaning academic bias, you personally and your department does. It does make me worry that you're not producing an accurate representation of society itself. And that's what I think is the real problem for me here, is that they already don't seem to understand that they're supposed to have a purpose to the general public. And then they're even further taking a subsection of the public that they're getting, because college naturally filters out about 50% of America. And then you're filtering out another 20% just because the conservatives generally flee from college campuses. And then you're going to filter another 15% out into grad school. And you're taking this weird subsection of people and you're focusing on this 20% of the country. And they're the highly educated and they're all talking to themselves. And they're reinforcing this idea that they don't have any grander purpose. They don't have any, there's no sense of Americanism anymore to them. They don't belong. It's not for them. They don't have to do anything to reinforce the values that they were brought up with themselves. I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit, but what do you think?
I think part of the issue can be that society is obviously like very individualistic, and therefore the sense of community has kind of, unfortunately, it's somewhat foreign. And I think that can be also the problem within the university, is like when you have scholars who are super specialized, teaching is a second tier priority for a lot of them, and not for all of them. I think like there's some brilliant scholars who are also phenomenal teachers and who genuinely care about teaching. Leslie Alexander, who just joined ASU from the Ohio State University, I took one of her classes for the master's program, and she's an absolute brilliant scholar and an absolute phenomenal teacher, and truly cares about both her scholarship and teaching.
Right.
But I think part of the problem can be is that, well, I'm here for scholarship, but I have to teach. Mm-hmm. And I think having that mindset is unfortunate, because then you're not going to care about, like, teaching is an art. People go to school to learn how to teach. You have to get certificates. I mean, there's a lot of work in just being certified to teach. And I think that can be also just, part of kind of the bigger problem with having a disjointed understanding of history, because you have scholars who are brilliant in their field, but aren't necessarily good communicators to the general public because they don't care nor maybe focus on teaching, which I think is unfortunate. And I think that's probably one of the many reasons why there's unfortunate kind of brittle relationship between the ivory tower and scholars and the general public, and even with scholars and students, I think, just across the board.
Yeah, I think COVID made that relationship between students and professors a little worse than it was. That I know personally that I realized that I like to joke that working with academics is like trying to herd cats. And it's like trying to herd cats, but through Zoom calls now and email, which is almost literally impossible. That, I worry that part of the problem, and I have felt this even in undergrad. I felt this. I can remember the first 400 level undergrad class I took. I was worried about this idea that the ivory tower, academia, the academy, college doesn't really work for anybody but itself. And the reason I thought that was because the first 400 level class that I took was an Ottoman history class with a professor at Bloomsburg University, and he had 7 or 8 books, and they were all, with the exception of one of them, they were interesting. If you're into history, if you like the study of history, if you really want people to dig through documents and explain their translations and where they went to do things, these were good histories. And it's not that they don't have value, but it's that they're jargony and they're written very clearly for an academic press and for an academic audience. And that these were people who had full-fledged careers. And I don't think that these are unrepresentative of academia as a whole. I don't know what the numbers would be, but I would would bet you that that more sitting professors at universities, because Arizona State alone has what, 50, 60 historians? It's pretty high. And you think that there are 50 state schools and there are 50 U's of, and then there are how many schools in each state around the country. That I wouldn't be surprised that the majority of sitting academics in any department really don't write or do anything for anybody but themselves, especially when teaching is a secondary concern. If you're already writing essentially for an academic audience and you're researching something that's purely for interest, so you can, because you research to keep getting paid to keep getting researched. It's sort of a never-ending cycle. It's like being a politician and having to ask for money every 2 years so you can stay in office. It's sort of what they're doing. But if you're not writing for the general public, and teaching is very clearly not a major concern for a lot of them, I wonder if that hasn't trickled down to the idea that the subjects themselves aren't treated as carefully as they should be. That one of the things I can remember too, and this maybe is the better example here, is that I took an English literature class at Bloomsburg. It was your stereotypical the masterpieces of English literature, Shakespeare, Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet, and I don't remember what all the works were. Maybe some Mark Twain and something, trying to read Huckleberry Finn and really trying to understand these books. And instead of actually appreciating literature at any point in time, instead of actually the class being about the study of English literature, all we did the whole time was talk about why these books were outdated and how the language was affecting people that were non-white, or how the books were written almost primarily by straight men. It like the whole thing had been corrupted to be about something that it wasn't. And I'm not saying that all departments or all classes are like that, but that's not really useful to anybody other than the person who's being paid to study English literature in that specific way. I didn't come here to understand why Shakespeare is not inclusive. I came here to understand Shakespeare. And that's just an example I have, but I can't help that. Who is that for? What does that do for me, especially when I've paid you $50,000 over a 4-year period to come to your university to get a degree that you told me would get me a job in something? What is that for? What good has that done me that I can critique Mark Twain in a way because he wasn't inclusive enough? What does that do for anybody? And if the whole thing wrapped up in that, if you're going to teach something that isn't applicable to 95% of people, and then teaching is already your secondary importance as the part of your profession, it's the thing that's less important to you, what good is that actually doing? What function is that serving? How is that making a better prepared group of people to go out in the world? I don't see how that's actually useful anymore.
Yeah, I think as you were kind of talking, I was thinking about the relationship between popular history and academic scholarly history, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I think, like you were talking about, just how a lot of the really good history books tend to be jargony, and tend to be kind of graduate level or higher. And I think that is also kind of part of the issue is that you have popular historians who can write really well. I will say that a lot of the popular history books are written really well. They're just unfortunately not always historically accurate, which is the issue. So you have the general public picking up a book that's written really well. It's convincing, it's engaging, and yet there's historical inaccuracies kind of laid throughout because they have this idea of a narrative that isn't necessarily true, but mm-hmm. they want it to be, or they got paid to say it was, or whatever it might be. And I think that can also be, part of the larger issue. It's just that there's that gap seems to kind of be getting wider and wider. You have scholars who, if they're just kind of doing their scholarship on their own, teaching for themselves or getting paid just to do research and teaching secondary, then they're going to write just to that, like you were saying, that 20% who are all just in cahoots with each other.
Mhm.
And yet you have the rest of the 80% who maybe want to know, but there's a small percentage of people who write for them, and yet it's not necessarily by professionals.
Right. And I wonder then, in the context of the original question, is that because people are inarticulate about the past, say that you don't know much, okay, and you're 31, you're a dad with 2 kids, and you go, okay, well, I had a business degree and I work for some insurance company, but I've decided that I would like to learn about German history because that's where my family comes from. But I'm not going to go to college because I went to college already, and I checked a couple historians, maybe that I knew the name of for whatever reason, but the books come back and they go, oh, that doesn't look like it's for me because I don't understand half the title. So you go, I mean, so you go and you pick up a popular history. And to be honest, I don't actually know any popular German history books off the top of my head. I know you could get them, but they're almost all about Hitler. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know of I can't think of one that's like the Germany's from 1200 to 1800. I don't know of any like that. But say you find one and you come away with that being maybe not an inaccurate understanding. Maybe it's not wholly perfectly accurate because the person who wrote it was a professional writer, not a professional historian. I don't know if that is a horrible thing. I think you're right that that's part of the problem. I still think having an incomplete view of something is better than having no understanding of something at all. But I guess the big question I'm still left with is if the Academy doesn't want to write popular history, because I know you've heard that from somebody before, that I've heard several professors tell me that, well, popular history is kind of a joke, and or, well, we wish we could write more like popular historians, but we just don't know how, or we don't have the time. If they're not going to do it, if the people who get paid to write and teach people about the past aren't going to do it, and these people are going to fill in, and whether or not that they're 100% accurate is an issue, yes. How do you find a middle ground? Because that's something I've been wondering for a while, at least a year now, maybe 2. How do you find a middle ground between an academic who gets paid to write history and teach it, but doesn't really want to do either of those things in an accessible way? How do you reconcile that with somebody who does want to, but never went through the professionalism of actually doing it?
Collaboration. I think if you had someone who can write really well sitting alongside of a professional who can't write as well, but who knows the history deeply and thoroughly, I think that relationship could create an outstanding result. I think that could be, maybe an answer. I don't know necessarily how well it would work, but I think if both are kind of having issues, I think by putting them together, you could actually create something really meaningful and really good. You always have exceptions, like Carol Anderson, who's a brilliant scholar who writes about African American history and race in America, and she's brilliant, and she can write masterfully. Like, her writing is exquisite, but I think that's a rarity. So I think just with having a historian who knows the history, and you have someone who wants to write about it and who can write really well, I think just putting them in the same room to write a book together would be, I think, really healthy, just for everyone.
I think that would be. It's not a bad idea. It's unfortunate that people like Carol Anderson are not as common as I wish they were. Daniel Immerwahr too. I don't know if you ever read his book, The How to Hide an Empire. I think he teaches at Boston or Northwestern, something like that. That's well done history. It's kind of niche. It's about like all of America's satellite islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean. But it was really, really well written, and he's a sitting academic. It is unfortunate that that's not as common as I think we all wish it was. I wonder though if the big thing I think about that is like I think it's a good idea, but I know enough historians to know I don't know if their egos would let them have somebody else write their books for them. I just I don't know. I feel like that would be not to say that they're egotistical, but that it would be like a smear on your professionalism that you're having to have somebody else write a book in a way that's accessible to the general public. I don't know that feel I feel like a lot of people would take that as a personal hit against their own self-worth. Um, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the feeling that I get. So I want to move on now to an actual because I focus on a question here. Um, what exactly, in your understanding, is the reason to study history at all?
The question of the ages, right? Um, sometimes I sometimes have difficulty answering that question because I just genuinely love history.
Mhm.
So kind of being within that passion that I have for it, sometimes it's just what drives me. It's what gives me joy. So sometimes like when I have to step back and actually think about that question, it can be rather difficult. But I think what I find necessary in it is that studying the history is also just studying humanity, knowing who we are, knowing how we came to be who we are. I think having an understanding of the past gives us a better clarity for the present. And like you were saying, nothing new under the sun is what a lot of historians say. And we say that because there's a relevance between the past and the present. And I think obviously as we're bound by time, which is always our understanding is moving forward. We can't go back in the past. So if as we progress in time, there's a natural desire, I think, to perfect it. There's a natural desire to want to do better, and I've understood that in order to maybe do better, we have to know the past. So I think there's kind of a natural desire to understand the past, but I think that one of the biggest importance is just to have that connection between all of humanity and not just kind of our bubble in this space and time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so because I would agree with you on most of that. You made me think of the Maya Angelou quote that you cannot know where you are if you do not know where you've been. And that I think I think that she wrote that or said that in reference to having understood the past. She loved history herself. Um, and I think that that is where I am at myself about you have to know how you got to where you are. One of the reasons I have always said to people that I wanted to study history was because I wanted to know how we got to where we are now. I wanted to know the circumstances about what happened. Why is this city named New whatever? There's a reason for that. Why is my language based off of
Mm.
50% French? There's a reason for that. Why do people drink coffee in America, even though the fact that coffee is not native to here? There's a reason for all of those things. Why did the Aztecs die off? There's, you can study the past and you can figure out um, how we got to where we are. You can't understand perfectly because you cannot take the eye of Sauron and scour the past perfectly and understand exactly what's happening. You don't have the magnifying glass so powerful as to understand exactly what led to the present, but you can form a more accurate picture of where you stand if you know what it is that people went through to get to where you are now. Um, and I wanted to say, off of the back of what you had said about, oh, help me here. The last thing you said. Um,
About having needing to understand the past in order to kind of progress to the future.
yes. Yeah. About. Do you feel like we've? Oh, and that too. Do you feel like we've sort of lost that a little bit recently? that you can actually, this is what I had to do the other day about, there's this modern trend about wanting to undo the past. People want to undo history. Um, and I feel like that's losing sight of the whole point. You can't undo what happened. And I don't even necessarily know, like, it's not obvious to me that attempting to right past wrongs is always a good thing, even though that is sort of the general mindset today. I think you hear people say that we're going to right the wrongs of the past, and that's absolutely going to be a good thing. I don't know that that's true necessarily. Um, yeah, do you feel like we've lost a little bit of the notion that the past necessarily leads to a brighter future if you understand it?
No, I don't. Because the reason that I think there's nothing new under the sun is because we keep repeating ourselves. I think part of human history and part of humanity is that we're inherently, kind of fallen people, that we aren't always going to be perfectly good, and therefore, I mean, just like if we you and I account our own lives, we make the same mistakes over and over again. Our lives aren't this like perfect trajectory, right? So if no one's, and I would say, maybe some people might think that they are, but I would argue that no one's life is like perfectly, just going in a nice trajectory.
Right.
So why would we expect for humanity as a whole to do the same? I think it's just kind of it's a misunderstanding of who we are as whole. I think, and yeah, just to have this idea of like we're always just going to progress in this really nice line is kind of something that we tell ourselves because that's ultimately our hope. And I don't think that hope is necessarily misplaced. I think it's just inaccurate. For if we see where we've been, which has mountaintops and valleys within human history,
Yeah.
that means the future will hold the same thing. We're going to make grave mistakes as people, and we're going to make great accomplishments as well. So I think having that understanding of life is this journey that goes through all sorts of ups and downs, and therefore humanity will do the same. I think having that understanding will actually help us, one, understand the past. Like you said, I mean, stuff happened in the past that happened. We can't go back and change it. And I think there's an ability in terms of correcting past wrongs. I think that can actually be a good thing, because that's part of who I think we are as well, and who we ought to be. If I make a mistake, if I wrong you, it's part of my duty as just a fellow human being, and a friend of yours to right that wrong.
Mhm.
And so I think as a community, as humanity, we should strive for the same. But I think that this idea of maybe like canceling culture, I think part of it is, we want to just erase certain parts of history, which we can't. But I think when I kind of hear that saying, I more so think of, there's more so the past has consequences, essentially. All
Yeah.
actions have consequences, and very poor actions have grave consequences. And so kind of this idea of like canceling culture, or doing whatever that can kind of mean for people, I think sometimes can be a good thing, because that means something that has happened in the past has not had a consequence, and now it does. And that's just kind of a natural part of who we are, and natural part of making choices, either good or bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think that attempting to right past wrongs is an inherently bad idea. In fact, I would agree, and I think that more often than not, it is a noble goal to try and fix things that have happened. My contention with that is I don't always know that it's true that making people in the present do so right some kind of wrong that people like them in the past did is fair or accurate. It's the the thing that always like the thing in America that always makes me that makes me think this way is that slavery happened. No one can deny that. It's a horrible thing. And there's all kinds of narratives about what it was, why it was, where it went. That's not really the purpose, is that the institution had consequences and that had fallout over the next century, even arguably today, depending on who you ask. But you come back to like simply the question of reparations. I don't know that it's obvious that you should make people 170 years removed from that make up for things that they may not have had any hand in. And that's I'm not even taking a side. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's not a good thing. It's that in today's world, in today's context, that is very obviously a good thing. And you're not allowed to say so otherwise. I mean, of course, there's a 50% of the country that doesn't agree. Like you talk to conservatives and they'll tell you that's bad. But if you talk to somebody who goes to a college or is in the news or is a professor, they're going to tell you that's a good thing and that people need to repent and pay for things they didn't do. It's that righteousness of mind that you clearly don't understand the past very well. You know that something happened, but I don't think you have an accurate or healthy understanding of what actually took place and who is responsible for that thing. Because what do Polish and Russian immigrants who moved to America in the 1920s have to do with slavery in the South? Why would you make people whose parents have been here for a generation that moved here from Greece pay for things that happen to people who don't look like them because they happen to be white? Like that's the kind of stuff that I think is a misuse of history. And I don't think that people understand what they're talking about. But I think that that's willful. I think that there's a willful ignorance there because it serves a narrative. The question here that I want to ask is that if history is about understanding where we've been so we can better understand where we are or where we're going, how do you account for people who will very obviously misrepresent things? They will take their own spin on something. They will teach things in a way that is counterproductive. One of the things I wanted to mention was that I had Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States was written in the 1980s. It is a commonly cited book that shaped a generation of thinkers and how to think about history. And the biggest thing on the back of Howard Zinn of this history is that it's a history of social activism in America. And so it's got a political bent. And so you're writing a history that has informed a generation of scholars and thinkers that has a very obvious political bent. And if we're supposed to understand where we were or where we came from to understand where we are now, how do we account for people who very obviously have a political or personal project in mind?
It's a good question. I don't know if I necessarily have like an answer for it. But I think that, I mean, it's hard because then you kind of get into this, maybe this idea of like absolutism when you're teaching history, and there's like only, I'm guessing kind of what you're saying is that when people will argue for a history or write a history, they're kind of saying like this perspective is it, ignore all the other ones. And I think that unfortunately within like the field of history, there's this idea that can go around neutrality is obtainable, when I don't think that is true. Personally, I don't think that any person can be perfectly neutral, completely, objective to what they're studying. You're always gonna understand history or understand a book or whatever it might be through a specific language which reads a certain way, through a specific culture, through a specific community, through a specific author. Like all of these things, there's more filters than we actually know. And I think that if once we understands that everyone writes and everyone reads with all of those lenses, then it's a little bit easier, I think, to account for this this idea that, you know, this history was written perfectly objectively, and that narrative is like the only narrative because we obtained this, you know, neutrality that is Platonic, you know, this unobtainable essence that everyone strives for. um I think once we get to that, which means we have to be in discussion with one another, right? So I think to kind of combat that idea is that there has to be a roundtable discussion on a regular basis. When somebody comes in with this history, there has to be another perspective that might hold it accountable. So I think there's just an accountability that is needed within that 20% that we kind of talked about. So rather than just feeding off of one another, I think everyone there also needs to hold each other accountable respectfully as well. And I think even the, you know, willful ignorance that you kind of talked about earlier, I think that can also go with the public. You know, if they know that, oh, this book is skewed one way or the other, and I kind of know that, but I'm going to be like, well, this is, I read this and this is kind of it because they're a scholar in this field or what have you. I think there might be a willful ignorance within the general public what they're reading. Because I mean, if you're going to read that type of book, I think there should be, you know, some level of accountability of knowing who wrote it, why they wrote it, and what perspective they're kind of writing it through. And I think just if you're going to adhere to something with such passion or vehemence, if you're in opposition to it, you probably should know a little bit more than just this is truth type of thing. That makes sense?
Yeah, a couple things. And so one I wanted to say is that with something like Howard Zinn's book, or another one I have here that I'll show in a moment, is I think the problem there comes back to my original concern about the civic duty, essentially, that professors are supposed to have. Like the teachers, like historians, are supposed to have a civic duty to teach people how to think about the past. But what if you never went to college? Or what if you went to college but you took a sociology course and that was your humanities, so you never took a history class? And so your first encounter with something like Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, which is very clearly, and while it's not written poorly, I've read it, it's a good book. I'm not Howard Zinn was a good historian, but it very clearly has a bent. It very clearly has a message. If you have never been trained to detect that message, especially if you're someone who's already sort of, you know, leaning in a certain direction, say you could do the same thing with, I mean, I don't have a necessarily great example of this, but maybe a book about Ronald Reagan, and this some, you know, historian writes a book about Ronald Reagan, and you're already sort of a conservative guy who hasn't ever been taught how to accurately read this for the biases that are clearly in it. You know, maybe it's too praiseworthy of Reagan because there are things you could criticize Reagan about. So say you're you know, some 25-year-old and you pick up Howard Zinn's book, you never had a history class in college, you didn't go to college maybe, and you don't know how to detect the fact that it's got a bias, because those biases sort of like, they tickle the reptile in the back of your brain and they go, oh yeah, I agree with all that stuff. But it's not necessarily true. That how, if we, or the people who are supposed to be teaching students how to recognize biases are themselves already biased in a direction, or aren't getting these people ever in their classrooms, that's the thing. How I'm struggling with, like, how do we work through that? Because you can't write an objective history. It's not possible. I would agree with you completely on that. You can do your damnedest. You can try. You really can. But you'll never write a completely objective history. And if you can't count, if you cannot account for a total objectivity in your own teaching style or writing style, and we're not teaching enough people how to read for bias in what they're reading, where do we go from there? Can we actually even recover what is like a sensible understanding of where we went from? or is that not possible anymore?
I don't know. The Gutenberg press was both a blessing and obviously it's a double-edged sword, right? You had before that, you just had experts who would tell you what the truth was, and there was no, there's not, you weren't able to write something for yourself and spread it, which had good things because there were less things out there to read that could be potentially false, but at the same time there were less things out there that could also be potentially true. And so in an age where you can access anything, you can there's millions of different books out there. I think to reel up into to get some get a history that is maybe more objective than, I'm not perfectly objective, but closer to, I don't think it's completely possible. I think what we can do is just do our best to partner with people who can write history, with people who understand history in a deep and thorough way, and then just present that as best we can. But I can't convince you necessarily that this book is better than this book. I can do my best, but I cannot actually change your mind.
Right.
So I think there's an element to where, we can do what we can, and little chips may, fall where they may, which is both frustrating, but at the same time, that's just a part of reality.
So it's our lot, unfortunately, to shuffle. We're the ferrymen, then, essentially. We can ferry people across the river Styx, but we can't change their fate. Is sort of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's I can, we can write all the books in the world that are as historically accurate as we can get them, and that won't change someone's mind necessarily. I mean, it's like certain people with, conspiracy theories that are, very far out there. There's books that are legitimately saying that's not true, and yet you still have people who wholeheartedly believe them.
Right.
And so, there's only so far that you can go as, I think, a historian, and it's just having that kind of trust within humanity to hopefully pick up your book, or read it with an open mind, but just kind of the nature of having freedom of thought and the ability to think for oneself.
Right. Do you think then that if we, because I would agree that there's only so much we can do, and I don't think we're doing nearly enough, if that's not obvious at this point. I think there's more we could be doing, but there's only so much we can do. Do you think then that possibly the bigger issue, maybe the real solution then would lie less in professional teaching methods, or what specifically is taught to students, and more sort of a cultural reaffirmation of why we need to understand?
I think that can be part of it. I think maybe the answer is more so in back in the beginning of our talk here. You asked the second question of, how can there kind of be a better relationship, even just within like discussing history, or perhaps anything, because you were talking about like there's this disconnect between, if I see something one way and somebody else sees something another way, there's this going on, like
Right.
You can't even talk about it.
Yeah, because I can't make you change your mind. I can only present my side, and then you have to change your own mind, or at least open your mind enough, or I have to do the same thing to see your side. And that that butting heads, it feels like we're I don't know what those dinosaurs are called that have like the metal plates that are round on the top of their head and they like rammed heads all the time. It's like how they fought each other. But that feels like what we're doing. It's like if you have a slightly
Mhm.
conservative opinion, I've got a slightly liberal opinion. This is it. This feels like all we're capable of anymore.
Right. And I think that might be a better answer than sometimes even writing another book.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you read a book, you're there's less accountability maybe, but in actual discussion, you're forced to actually have a connection with somebody. I mean, you do at a certain extent when you read a book, you kind of have this really really legitimate but distant relationship with that author.
Right.
But when you're in conversation with somebody, I think that's maybe where more of the change can happen, to understand somebody else's point of view, to be able to empathize. I think that in how if I'm imagining the future, um, I think that is a better route to go than having historians humbly discuss with the general public, maybe more so than write books about it. Yes, books might be able to reach more people,
Mm-hmm.
but I think conversation can actually more so change hearts, because you have that human connectivity that is
Yeah.
essential within within humanity, within our lives. And that's just, I think, unfortunately, with the rise of technology, with the abundance of social media, that art of conversation has been severed almost completely in a lot of ways. The difficulty people have articulating what they believe and actually listening and engaging with somebody else respectfully has deteriorated, I think, to a point where it's going to take a long time and a lot of work and a lot of determination, to get back to a place where we can have meaningful discussion,
Mm-hmm.
to agree to disagree, and also to understand different perspectives can actually give you a more holistic understanding of the past or any other topic for that matter.
Right.
Um, what do you think?
No, I agree completely. I think that Zoom, as as nice as this is that I can talk to you from 13 states away and 3 hour time difference, I think this is part of the problem. Is that
Hmm.
not for you and me personally. At the same time, it's weird. Do you remember Sikupek Gajraj's class about European history and the book about the French Revolution literary underground? And I've been thinking about this a lot.
Yes.
Is that there were all these guys during the French Revolution who wanted to write and wanted to be like great philosophical and political thinkers, and through the use of like sort of black market printing presses, they got their thoughts out to people, and so there was this mass like glut of information. Um, Zoom is like that. Zoom is the modern version of that. Zoom is the new printing press. Like the internet, YouTube, Zoom, that's the new printing press. It allows people to get information out there. You can release a book chapter by chapter on Substack now. You know, no one has ever been able to release a book online before and then get feedback in real time to make it better. That's not a thing that like ever existed. Um, it has done wonders for access to information. But what I'm afraid of is that it has replaced, like you said, the humanity of the informational exchange. Is that it's a hell of a lot harder for me to connect with people, especially those I disagree with, if this is the only contact I get with them. And it's impossible over text. Like emails, I can scream into an email all day long for months at a time. Uh, You're never going to get through to me because I'm just not going to listen because I don't have to. There's nobody right in front of me, trying desperately to make me understand them, or vice versa. There is no humanity in that exchange. Um, I think technology is part of the problem. It's one of the reasons. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was um, whether or not what your opinion is on this idea that technological progress and that historical progress, as it's called, is always good. I don't think that things are always better just because it's new. I don't think things are always better just because it's the future. Um, I don't think Zoom calls are an effective substitute for real conversation. I don't think people working at home on their computers in their bedrooms for the next 5, 10 years of their lives because COVID shut down all the offices is an effective substitute for having a working community. I've never worked in an office, but I can't imagine that's comfortable for everyone or a good thing. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe it is comfortable for everyone, but maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe you need to be around other human beings to be human yourself. Um, and it, what do you? So what do you think that? What do you think about the idea that? You think I'm onto something here that like Zoom is the new printing press and that it's both a good thing and potentially a bad thing? And what do you think about the idea of like historical progress? That progress is that we're always getting better. In the you know what I mean? Like as history marches on, things are always getting better for people.
Hmm. Um, I think, yeah, I think you're onto something with Zoom kind of being the new printing press. I think, like with anything, it can be a double-edged sword with, technological advances. There are great things that have come out of, technology. But it's when stuff, I think it's when things are replacing other things rather than something coming in and being kind of in balance with what has already been there.
Mm-hmm.
Like for Zoom, I think it's a great tool to connect with people who you could not connect with in a like in together in person. However, if you're replacing Zoom with that human connectivity, then that's the problem. So I think it's finding that balance of being able to see the pros of Zoom and seeing the benefits of it while also understanding its its cons as well, and so I think, if we're going to use something, let's use it to for good, good, and not replace it with something else that is better. But I think using it like this is, I would say this is better than like emailing or texting.
Oh yeah.
In that regard, it's a good thing. But in terms of connecting with some, if you and I could connect in person, I think that is better. If we were only to use Zoom for every, use of interaction communication, it's better than some, but it's worse than others. And I think technology can kind of be the same thing. Like having a phone can be great. If I'm lost, I can call someone for help. But at the same time, it's a vortex that can just suck you in. It's something that makes you feel omniscient when you're not, because you can have whatever you want at your fingertips. And it forces you to, if you're looking at that, you're not looking at something else, which could be another person.
Right.
And so I think just understanding that technology will always have pros and will always have cons will be the healthiest understanding as we move forward. And therefore, it can be good, it can also be bad. And so but if the bad outweighs the good, then I don't think that progress is needed nor beneficial. And in regards to like historical progress, no, I don't think we'll always get to like a better place. If we go back 2 centuries, there's a lot of bad things that happened in the past 2 centuries that were worse than 4 centuries ago. So to kind of have this understanding that historical progress is always in a upward trajectory is just a misunderstanding of the past. Like I said, history can be on mountaintops in some areas, and it can be in, Mariana's Trench and another piece of history. So to expect that it's always going to be this perfect upward trajectory is just it's an illusion that I think we want to believe, but we shouldn't.
Yeah, and I think that in particular concerns me, and that's why I feel like there's just it's part of that issue alone is part of why I wanted to start talking to people. Why I want to do something like this is because I can't shake, I can't help this idea. Like I cannot shake this idea that there are people who genuinely believe that things are constantly getting better, and how fundamentally misinformed that is. Is that 75 years ago, two of the worst atrocities in human history took place. That's not that long ago. Maybe 85 years ago now for World War II. The communists killed 100 million people in Russia in work camps. The Nazis exterminated 6 million Jewish people in death camps because of their ethnicity and their religion. Those things weren't, like you said, those things 85 years ago were not capable of being done 4 centuries ago. And that is where this mix of technological progress always being good and the general trajectory of history always being towards good too is just that's terrifyingly misinformed to me. That we have never, thankfully, had a nuclear fallout of any significant kind, but we did drop 2 nuclear bombs on the Japanese, as anybody who knows anything about history will know. That's still a possibility. I mean, they're just still sitting in the ground, lying around. That it's naive to me in a like I said, it's naive to me in a terrifying way to be able to look at where we've come from in the last 100 years and go, yeah, no, we know what we're doing. We're going good places. That are you kidding me? What was it? Just in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Do you realize how insignificantly long ago that is? That's only 32 years ago at this point. I wasn't even alive. You weren't even alive for that. I don't know. I have to develop this thought more because I don't know where to take this. I don't know how to counter that idea. I don't know how you even solve that problem. But every time I see somebody go, well, I'm going to take Uber, I'm going to get Uber Eats now, and I'm going to use my cell phone to order that, and I'm going to get back on my Zoom call, and you've completely replaced the humanity with technology. And at the same time, you believe that all of that technological progress is good while checking out from the fact that, while checking out mentally from how that technology is being used to track everything you do. That terrifies me. I mean, yeah, is it alarmist to say that I think Amazon could potentially use all of that data to hurt people? Yeah, that's silly. They're not going to do that. It's a company, they're not going to. But the fact is that somebody could. The Chinese government could hack Amazon, like I'm sure it already has. It could steal all of people's private information. It could know everything about everyone in the United States. The idea that war is a thing of the past is silly. Like that could happen here. We're still fighting two of them in the Middle East. We never stopped. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything? Do you have any thoughts on this? Because I'm genuinely scared when people tell me that they think we're going in a good direction, because it to me it doesn't sound like that they're thinking critically at all about where we've come from and where we seem to be going again.
Yeah, I mean, I think one particular philosopher comes to mind, Charles Taylor, who is personally one of my favorite philosophers alive today, and also written some of my favorite books. One of them called "The Secular Age," and in it, he's just saying kind of like essentially, how did we go from believing that, and this is going to be slightly different, but I'll kind of explain it here. Is that like in 1500, not believing in God was like it just didn't exist, right? Like one believed in God, following that was different, but just believing that there was transcendence was everyone believed it. And so how did we come in 500 years to flip it completely? now belief in God is lost for a lot of people, or just having believing in God is just this idea that is silly now, that the idea of transcendence is illegitimate. It's unscientific. And so
Right.
he's in that tome, he's exploring, like, how do we get there from here? And one of the things he says is we were porous people who now have become buffered people. And before, the porous self is what he calls it, is that we were people that in order to function fully as humans within society, we needed outside things. So for him, he's talking about transcendence, connectivity. We needed that in order to actually become our whole selves. So transcendence was necessary. We were open for things. We could soak things up that would make us full, that would make us whole. And now we've become this buffered self where we kind of are within this eggshell that nothing can come in. This idea of individualization and has created, I don't need God. I don't need other people to function fully and wholly. I can just do things on my own. Whereas before, it's like, no, I need transcendence. I need God. I need people in order to find meaning in life. And so since that flip has changed, I think part of that idea, like, progression isn't going to kind of go forward until we go back. Personally, I see this as porous people, as people who see the need for things other than ourselves internally that make life meaningful. And so I think once, if we're looking progressively in that essence, we've, I think deteriorated a lot. And I think Charles Taylor's absolutely correct in that articulation and in that idea that the progressive state is not always going up, but in the case that he's talking about has actually gone down. That going from porous to buffered has inhibited our ability to communicate effectively, to love one another fully, to be able to have freedom of thought, freedom of religion as well in a lot of ways. So I think going back to that idea of being porous, of needing people, needing transcendence, I think we need to go back to something like that as humanity, as a culture.
Yeah, I would agree, and this is coming that it's coming from the non-religious, like, liberal socialist. So I'm I'm absolutely one of the stereotypes of people who doesn't need other people. But I would completely agree. I have found, especially over the last year or two, that my life is more meaningful in duty, in community. That there's more purpose to my existence when I'm focused on other people and what I could be doing to help humans, not myself. Like the idea, abandoning the idea that happiness will give your life purpose was a big step for me. Is that happiness is fleeting and momentary, and you can't build a life off of happiness. That happiness often derives itself from community, purpose, duty, meaning. So I think he's right about that. But my question there is, though, if you're one of those people who thinks that history is progress and technology is progress, you're also one of those people who thinks, well, the cat's out of the bag. You cannot put the cat back in the bag. How do we ever get to people who think that way? Because the idea of a return to a different state of self is something I would agree with. I think there's lots of things that we could return to a little bit. One of the things, like, we could tamp down the liberalism just a little in America. Again, from the liberal socialist dude, we could tamp it down just a little bit because we've taken it a little too far. We've thrown out the idea that humans even exist now. We're all just like amorphous clay blobs that do all the same things as long as you stick all the parts on right. That we could tamp the liberalism back in the bag a little bit. How do we ever get through to people who like that, though, who think that progress is always good, that the cat's out of the bag and therefore it's never going back in. How do you get to people who think that God is a thing of the past, that community and belief in something greater than yourself is a thing of the past?
I think by showing them those things rather than telling them those things. So if I'm going to, like, for instance, claim to you that, so like personally, I'm a Christian, right? So I believe that, to be like Jesus is what I'm called to do, which means to walk in love, which means to walk in kindness and humility. And therefore that is what I am shaping my life around, is the person of Jesus and what he has called us to be, which is all those things I just said. But if I just tell you those things and that's what I should do, but I don't actually show you those things, then there's a disconnect within my life, and then therefore how I'm connecting with you. And so rather than just telling the cat to get back in the bag, I need to show the cat maybe where the bag is, and that going back in the bag is, maybe a good idea. And so I think part of it is just showing people that, having meaningful discussions with them, and I think connecting with them on a true human level is necessary to show them that this progress isn't always a good thing, rather than just yelling at them to say, like, this isn't a good thing. But just actually showing them that it's why it's not a good thing and how it's not a good thing, and that other people who think differently, that there's legitimacy to their beliefs. And that goes for, like, both ways as well. And it's not just for, me telling you or showing you, but it's you showing me and telling me at the same time.
Right.
So I think having that mutual respect and that mutual care will go a long way. But I think that won't be done through just telling people that their view is wrong, but more so showing them the why you believe what you believe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's the persuasive method.
I hope that is that.
Yeah, I mean, that to me sounds exactly like the persuasive method in writing, is that you're just taking, the problem with the persuasive method in writing is that you can write anything, but people aren't necessarily going to believe what you've told them. And what you're doing is applying the persuasive method in writing to to a human version of showing you, this is what I gain from the things that I believe or the actions that I take. I think the world could do with a lot more of that. The funny thing is that something we keep coming back to, and that's a big driving force in why I wanted to start talking to people, is because I don't feel like we're having a lot of meaningful discussions anymore. Despite the fact that we live in an age with Zoom, where you can talk to literally anyone at any point in time. You can Google literally anything at any point in time, so long as you have an internet connection. I don't think that we're actually doing anything meaningful anymore. Most of us, on an average, I don't want to call out anybody. I'm not going to say names, but I have a lot of friends that are your typical mid-20 something, early on in their career, have a college degree, live on their own in an apartment, maybe have a house pet, eat takeout food 4 nights a week. A lot of the guys play video games way more than they should. It's something I struggle with a lot, and I'm better now, but I used to play way too many games too, because it filled a void of meaning. It didn't do anything. I didn't know what to do with myself, and so I'd play video games because that was, well, it gives me something to do. And that I know a lot of people who fit perfectly the issues that we're talking about. But at the same time, I would think that they would tell you that their life has meaning, because I think that their understanding of what meaning is wrong. I think not wrong. I think it's not the right word. I think they have a misinterpreted understanding of meaning. Is they have the career, they have the college education, maybe they've got a significant other, Well, that was what we were raised on to be meaningful. I mean, I can't ever remember a day in which my parents didn't tell me you were going to go to college, you were going to get a job, you're going to marry somebody. But that doesn't necessarily provide life any meaning. And you live in an age in which you can have anything whenever you want, which includes access to literal millennia of information about like human wisdom. And that's the weird disconnect we're going to. Like, this is the whole technology thing as being a good thing. Technology gave you the option to have all of Grecian wisdom and Roman wisdom ever recorded. And yet everybody went over here to Starbucks and Snooki. That, like, if that's even the thing, if she's even the thing anymore. Like, you know what I mean? It's like we have, I don't even know if she's like, I don't know if she's, I don't know if Snooki's a real person not anymore. But like, we have the opportunity. You can learn a language in weeks now on almost any free app on your phone. And yet people went to the hedonism, like, because there's no better word for that. It's hedonism. It's just wanton, like, liberalized hedonism. And I don't know how we ever get back from that, because it just seems that, like, I saw a commercial the other day for something. Oh, what the heck was that? It was a coffee holder, not for coffee cups, but for Starbucks cups. It was an attachment for a fridge that fit plastic Starbucks cups in your fridge. And I thought, is that really what we need right now? Do you know what I mean? Is that, like, we've replaced the idea of making yourself a cup of coffee in the morning so effectively with the idea that you go to Starbucks for coffee that we now have to adapt our fridges to the Starbucks coffee. And that's the thing that I can't, like, that to me feels like that's a symptom of the idea that we have access to all of this good information and we're just not doing anything with it. We have access to a favorite professor of mine, Dr. Jordan Peterson from Canada, at the University of Toronto, says that every person has a spark of divinity in themselves. Every individual has a spark of the divine. And it feels like we have a spark of the divine and we've been given another one with the access to information, and yet we went for all of the sodomy. But, like, what happened? And how do we ever, I outside of an individual level and coming to that realization on your own terms, how do you ever start to convince other people that that's where they need to go?
I mean, with like I'm reminded of Alistair McIntyre's quote where he says, you cannot, I can't know what I ought to do unless I first answer the question of what story do I find myself a part. Mm-hmm. And, you know, like, if you have all of the information, it's almost like I don't know where to go because I don't know what story I'm a part of. Mm-hmm. I don't know what, and I think what he's getting at is like, what if you don't have a purpose, then you're not really going to know what to do. And so you just kind of do things aimlessly. And I think that might be a good place to start is, asking people, well, what story do you find yourself a part? Like, what story within humanity, what purpose, what worldview do you find yourself a part? And only from that axiom, can you then take the next step of, this is what I ought to do then. Because when people skip that step, they skip the question of, what is my purpose on earth? What was I created for? Or, why am I here? What should I do? If you can't or won't answer that question, then doing anything after that is not the same. There's less of a foundation, I think. And so I think that can be part of the problem. Then you have this massive information overload. And I think when you have that, it doesn't feel like you need to answer that question. But if you don't answer that first question, then you're just kind of you can do whatever you want, or you're not going to actually go to the things that you need to go within that information. So does that kind of make sense?
Yeah,
That's kind of
no,
what
you
I'm
actually
thinking.
hit on something I want to talk a lot about, but we don't have time for that today. That'll be another discussion. Is you said about finding about if you don't have purpose, you need to ask yourself what story of humanity do you find yourself a part of? And that's something I want to talk
Mhm.
about is the power of narrativity to human beings. Is that
Yep.
we are, as Tolkien and as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis like to say, is that we are creatures who like to tell stories. We are intrinsically storytelling creatures. We are narrative beings. Um,
Yep.
and I think a big part of modern America's problems is a sense of purposelessness on an individual level, mixed with access to any kind of cause you can find, you can get your hands on, uh, and that they're all competing. All of these different causes that purposeless people have found are now competing to tear everything apart because no one can agree on anything anymore. And we've always had a competing element. There's always been, especially politically, there's always been competing elements. But even on a social level, it feels like the very fabric of social life in America has ripped itself apart over the last, I would say, 2 years, but really the last 5 probably, because people have turned inwards and gone, well, I don't know who I am. So this thing that I believe, that's what I am now. I am now the thing I believe. I am not me. I am the beliefs that I hold. And if you challenge my beliefs, you are challenging me. That's when I an example of that is when you hear people say that you're challenging my existence, you're challenging my story. That talk about that at another time, but you're on to something there. I think you are dead on to something with that guy's comment. Um, I wanted to ask you 2 last things, and then I am going to have to go to work. But this has been very productive, and I appreciate you doing this with me. The
Yeah,
last
absolutely.
things that I wanted to say was, and this is the last big one, was I wanted to get to this idea um, about having a positive functional narrative as a country. But one of the things that I think is weird, especially when I went to grad school at ASU, is I don't know anybody who like really thought of themselves as an American. I don't know a lot of people who really hold like a strong national pride anymore. I do here at home. I mean, I'm from a pretty conservative small town in the middle of Pennsylvania, and you've got a pretty darn strong sense of America here. I mean, every house has an American flag. Half of them have those Gadsden "Don't Tread on Me" flags, which is that's its own whole problem. But there's a sense of who they are here. There's a sense of American pride here, and it was common at Bloomsburg, but Bloomsburg is a smaller school and it's only down the road, so it's a smaller school in a pretty conservative area. But the idea is that there's not a very strong national sense of identity. Um, and I remember a quote, Dr. O'Donnell is a fantastic professor, but I can remember her very specifically making fun of me one day when we were reading an article about British military strategy in Europe and how whoever the author was of this particular piece had said that, oh, and the Irish were there too. Like the Irish were just there because they wanted to be. And I got real mad about that because if you know me, you know that like you do not talk about the Irish like they did anything of their own volition until about 40 years ago, because they didn't. The British forced them to do anything that they want, pretty much anything they wanted them to. And so in the 1700s, it was very weird to me for this historian to be like, "Oh yeah, the Irish were there too. They were along for the ride." Like, no, they were literally forced at gunpoint probably to be there. And she made fun of me saying that, oh, everyone thought ethno-nationalism was dead. That she said, well, everybody, let's move on before Jason gets out the Irish flag and starts singing "Come Out Ye Black and Tans." And as funny as that is, and as silly and comical and as too far into one direction as my overwrought sense of Irish pride is, I don't think that we have a very, at least the side of the aisle I find myself on, which is the left-leaning, democratic, liberal side of America, doesn't really have a very good understanding of America anymore. I don't think we have a very positive self-view. And I'm not going to lump you into this because I don't know exactly where you stand. But the big thing I wanted to ask then is that there has to be some importance in a positive self-national conception. Like, there has to be some kind of importance in viewing yourself and the country you're a part of in some kind of positive light. Because I can't help but think that a lot of our problems are because we seem to have this entirely negative view of who we are as a country. Um, is there value in studying the wrongs that have been committed? Absolutely. I will never disagree with that. But it feels like for a lot of us, especially in the academy, it feels like the wrongs have replaced any sense of pride. And I'm just wondering if you feel that way, what you think about that, what maybe you think the solution is. And I wanted to bring up, I'll bring up something then after you say your piece. But
Yeah, I can definitely sense that. I think that some of that um, replacement of national pride with just kind of this idea that America is good. Um, I think, I mean, everyone's going to look at the nation and its history through their own lens, right? Their own experience. And I think for some people who are again like, oh yeah, America's always been great, it is great, and it always will be great. I think I think the reason that is because the history will have favored them, whether it's their politics, their race, their gender, whatever it might be, has favored them. But then you talk to people who um, have said no, like America's past is evil and very much not good. Are people who have historically been, um, you know, condemned, oppressed, enslaved, and I think that is a good thing to see America's history for what it truly is, which it claims, you know, liberty and justice for all, but it actually that statement has not been true historically in the nation, I believe, at all. And so I think to once the replacement with seeing America's past, I think for what it actually truly has been, um, is a good thing. I think that national pride was misplaced with a type of identity that was beneficial for some, but not for most. Um, and while maybe like having that camaraderie with that small group of people has actually was the problem, in the narrative that America is great, you know, was great and will always be great, which I don't believe it was always great. I don't believe necessarily it is great as a country, because nations in of themselves are made up of people who are fallen, or people who make grave mistakes, people who are murderous, vehement, um, evil in some cases, but also good as well. So I think the maybe the answer is more so seeing it less of like, I am proud to be an American because of America's history, but more so I'm proud to live in this country because I love the people who are here. And so less of a sense of nationalism maybe, and more of a sense of community, is that regardless of like where you are. So I mean, because then you're gonna argue that some countries are good and some countries are evil, and you're like, well, people there's actual people in them, and you're kind of understanding this nation as evil or good based on your political, national, whatever perspective. um, but I think we should have less of a nationalistic pride and more of a community pride. And I think love your neighbor as yourself is more so the answer than being, you know, having kind of this national pride that covers all of the US and all of its history. So because I really do think that seeing seen America's past for what it truly has been, which is not liberty and justice for all, is an actual a good thing. It's like what C.S. Lewis talks about is going in, you can go in your basement, that there's rats down there, but if you don't turn on the light, you'll never know how many rats are there
Right.
until you actually turn on the light and seeing where those rats are. Then you can actually get them out and clean up your basement, right? I'm butchering it quite a bit, but that's kind of the overall thing. So I think when we see America's past for what it is, we're turning on the light and we're seeing like, ooh, this basement is really crappy. I was to believe it was clean and elegant and nice, but it really isn't. But we need to start cleaning it up so that everyone can come down here, not just some of the people, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
No, I'm going to cut you off. I agree wholeheartedly that, like I said, I will never say that it's not good to have studied the wrongs or to try to understand them or even to try to fix the ones that are fixable. It's absolutely true that the overly nationalistic history you got in high school and in middle school is two roses in the sun. It's, George Washington and the cherry tree. It's too much. It's not. It's exclusionary. It's a silly happy-go-lucky tale of the past that isn't accurate, and that isn't good either, because that's what I'm afraid of, is that we got taught that, and now we're in a stage where we've overcorrected way too far. At least half of us have, sort of on a grand scale, and that I don't think that. Look, are there problems? Yes. Does America have skeletons in its closet, its basement, and its attic? Absolutely. But some big questions that that are, what country doesn't? Because we're not alone in the fact that we have made mistakes. That's just, you would be incorrect if you claimed that. And it's not an excuse. That does not mean that we cannot do better. But you have to take that into context, that we are not alone in this matter. If the basement is full of skeletons, you don't explode the basement. You clean up the skeletons. You do not fundamentally restructure the basement after having blown it up. And that is there is a value in understanding different perspectives of the past. And there's a value in understanding how liberty and justice for all have been withheld from people. That is absolutely true. But I think we have to be careful about whether or not we're still going to uphold the values of liberty and justice for all, or if we're going to go, well, no, this whole thing has always, at its very core, been fundamentally corrupt, and it's not savable. Because those are very different, and that's not I don't think anybody wants to go down this road, really, where everything is fundamentally corrupt and nothing is savable. I don't really think we want to go there, even though we like to flirt with the idea that the whole thing is so foundationally bankrupt that we could never save it. The reason I say this, one of the things I wanted to say is, are you familiar at all with the 1619 Project from the New York Times?
A little bit, but I haven't gone too much in depth with it.
Okay, and so this is not the core problem. This is just one of the tendrils that exist in modern American discussion about this issue that I'm afraid of, is that, that I'm concerned that we're overreacting to, is that the 1619 Project was this historical journal by the New York Times. Nicole Hannah-Jones is the author, in which she claimed that America's true founding date was 1619, not 1776, because in 1619, the first ship with slaves in it reached North American shores. But in 1619, Jamestown hadn't even been founded. And so there's already some historical inaccuracies there, that America, as a country, isn't going to exist even conceptually for almost 170 years yet. 160 years or something like that. This is way, way before we had any conception of liberty and justice for all as people in general. Those ideas really don't exist in the way that they do in 1776. And so the idea is that the New York Times is the paper of record. It's a paper. It's had a long-standing history of being a professional newspaper, and a credible one, but it's trying to rewrite history, because it made this project, which won a Pulitzer Prize, into a educational platform that it then sent to schools. And California State uses this, and a couple other, like New York and Massachusetts do, I think. And that worries me, because I don't. Not only is it historically inaccurate, and it's a version of popular history that's done incorrectly. Even Dr. O'Donnell signed on to a letter about how that was a misrepresentation of American history, because the central claim about in the Pulitzer Prize winning section of the paper is from this book, actually, These Truths by Joe Lepore, which is the one novel version of American history. And the claim that they cite in the award-winning piece of the 1619 Project is an uncited throwaway line. Jill Lepore is a historian at Harvard, and it's one line in chapter 3 of this book with no citation. It's her interpretation of a document that we read in class, actually. I forget the name. It's the one about the British admiral or sea captain who promised to free slaves if they fought for the British in the Revolutionary War.
Lord Dunmore's
proclamation. Yeah, that. It's her interpretation of that is that the American Revolution was primarily fought to preserve the institution of slavery. That is her claim. It received loads of backlash from historians across the country. Like I said, even Dr. O'Donnell signed on to a letter about that because I talked to her about it. And then this whole project won a Pulitzer and was put into an informational packet to teach in schools. And that concerns me, because that's a fundamentally, like, is there value to understanding that part of America's past? Absolutely. But you're changing the entire structure of what the country's about. If you take the bones of America to be about trying to extend liberty and justice to all, but failing, sometimes miserably, to do that, and you change that to this, well, no, this has always and exclusively existed as a means to oppress people. Those are not the same thing, and they are not reconcilable. And that's what I'm worried about. That's the overreaction that I'm afraid that we've taken. And I'm just curious, if you think anything about that, maybe any thoughts you have. I don't know how to fix that exactly, because no one has fixed it yet. I don't, but you cannot fundamentally believe the place you live is a horrible place and always has been, and then still want to live in it. That doesn't work. It will have to change.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, you'll obviously want to change it for one reason or another. I don't know what the answer to that would be. I'd have to honestly chew on that to see kind of what the solution might be for, because when you have competing narratives, it's ultimately to kind of capture one's heart, right? So you're using more than just an intellectual history, but you're using emotional history, as well to captivate, which can be good, obviously, but also it can be poorly used as well. And I don't know enough about the 1619 project to speak one way or the other, so I won't comment on that. But I'd be happy to talk. I'd be happy to look into it and talk further ahead of time. But I do think that when you have a narrative, it's more than just an intellectual history. It's also, like I said, emotional history, and accounting for that is necessary.
What I'm afraid of is that narrativity is dishonest.
Yeah.
And I can't help but think that that's the problem inherently with narratives, is that they're dishonest fundamentally. But we seem to love them as human beings.
Well, they're this might be a totally different topic for a different time. But I think narratives can convey truths in a different way, rather than being factual. I mean, so for instance, I mean, you read, we're both Tolkien fans. There's a lot of truths within Tolkien stories, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of legitimate truths about who we are as human beings, the nature of this world, and yet it's within a story of fantasy. So I don't know if I would say like narratives are always misleading, because I think there can be core elements of truth within narratives, but it's within an imaginative world. I think that can sometimes get a little hairy with narratives, but yeah, narratives I think might be a totally different discussion that we can go
The
very,
power of
very deep into.
narrativity and narratives in general is going to be it's going to be its own thing. There's a lot of people I want to talk to about that, because I have become, and I'll be honest, like slightly obsessed with the human capacity for narrativity. It's driving me just a little nuts that everything seems to be, does it fit the box? Okay, if it doesn't, forget it. Or if it can fit the box, shave off the irrelevant parts and make it fit. And that we seem to naturally do that. And I am not saying that I'm perfect. I absolutely never would say that I haven't also done things that are narratively untrue. I know that I'm not an entirely unbiased person. You can't eradicate yourself of biases. But I am deeply concerned about several runaway narratives about America in public life. And I don't know if anybody's really talking about them in meaningful ways, or really like pumping the brakes on them a little bit and going, yeah, hey, I see your point, but there's like 12 other points that are also valid. That there's just a lot of stuff that has me concerned. So we'll do that another day. But I think there was one last thing I wanted to. Actually, we might have gotten to everything. Okay. I think we got to everything, actually. Is there anything you would like to say? Any parting line? Anything you'd like to discuss that I didn't get to?
No, I think this has been a fabulous conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and appreciate you talking with me.
Yeah, same. A podcast about talking to people about history won't work if no one wants to talk to me. So I am equally grateful that you decided that you would talk to me, and I would love to do this again. The last thing I want to do then, before I sign off, is that each week that I do this, or every time I get an episode up or whatever, I want to try and promote a really good history book, whether they're
cool.
And especially ones that are actually written by historians. And so I wanted to start with what is probably the mother of all well-written popular history books by an actual historian, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. From 1999, it's a Pulitzer winner. It's one of the granddaddies of global history. It didn't spark the whole thing, because global history had existed as a concept academically for a while, but it is probably the most well-known, even still 22 years later, which is impressive for a history book, because things don't usually last 22 years before having at least something that competes with it. But it is absolutely fantastic. If you want one of the most well-written general history books that you can get your hands on, just about the fate of humanity, about human history as a concept, about different continents. He covers everything from Africa to China to the US to Australia, and the general trend of humanity over the past 2 millennia. It's incredibly well written, and it's been incredibly well received. You couldn't go wrong with it. And it's like $12 at any used bookstore, so it's not expensive. And if you haven't read it, actually, you should, because it's very good.
I haven't, so I will make sure to pick that up.
Okay. Yeah, this is really, really good. So I honestly, if you haven't read it, I'll just give you my copy when I get back to Arizona. So, all right, okay. I have to go to work, so I'll see you later, man. Thanks.
All right, have a good one, man.
You too.